In a forgotten corner of Mississippi, a gold-trimmed invitation arrives at the door of a struggling single mother. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Troy Henderson and Abigail Carter, her ex-husband and the daughter of the man who always looked down on her. The handwritten note at the bottom twists the knife. "We hope you'll be properly dressed. We wouldn't want to cause any embarrassment." What Troy doesn't know is that Grace has been keeping a secret for 5 years, a secret that comes in threes. When the church doors open and a vintage Rolls-Royce pulls up, no one is prepared for what happens next. 3 small boys with familiar blue eyes step out, and suddenly a perfect society wedding spirals into chaos. A mother's dignity, a father's betrayal, and the lies that shattered 2 lives are finally exposed in front of everyone who matters. Follow our channel for more heart-wrenching true stories that will leave you speechless. Like and comment to let us know where you're watching from, and share your thoughts on this incredible story of revenge, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. The steady hum of washing machines filled the small laundromat, tucked away on the forgotten outskirts of Greenwood, Mississippi. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Grace Chen, a petite woman with delicate features and tired eyes that had seen too much heartache, methodically folded clean towels, her calloused hands moving with practiced precision. The bell above the door jingled, but Grace didn't look up. Only when the mailman called her name did she raise her eyes. "Just bills today, Grace." "Sorry about that," he said with a sympathetic smile, placing the stack on the counter before tipping his hat and leaving. Grace sighed, pushing a strand of black hair behind her ear as she sorted through the pile. Electricity notice, water bill, final warning from the landlord. Her shoulders slumped with each envelope until her fingers touched something different. Thick, cream-colored paper with gold trim. The return address made her heart stop. Henderson Estate, 1420 Magnolia Avenue. For 5 years she had tried to forget that address. For 5 years she had failed. Grace's hands trembled as she carefully opened the envelope, the expensive paper feeling foreign against her work-roughened skin. Inside was an invitation card, ornate and pristine, the gold lettering catching the light. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Troy Henderson and Abigail Carter." The room seemed to spin. Troy Henderson, the man who had once promised her forever, who had held her through storms both literal and figurative. Troy, who had turned his back on her when she needed him most, who had believed the worst without question. And Abigail Carter, daughter of Robert Carter, the wealthiest man in the county, the man who had looked at Grace like she was something stuck to the bottom of his Italian leather shoes, the man who had whispered to his friends at the country club about Troy's little Asian waitress experiment. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that turned her blood to ice. "We hope you'll be properly dressed. We wouldn't want to cause any embarrassment." Grace's fingers clenched, crumpling the edge of the invitation. Through the thin wall behind the counter, she could hear a small cough. One of the children, her children, their children. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, its minute hand stuck between the 4 and 5. It had been broken for months, frozen in time just like her life had been the moment Troy walked away. Grace's gaze drifted to the worn sofa in the corner of the break room visible through the doorway. Beneath it, hidden from casual view, was a shoebox, her most precious possessions carefully preserved inside. Evidence of a life she once had, proof of truths never told. For a moment she stood perfectly still, the invitation heavy in her hands. Then, with sudden resolve, she walked to the window and stared out at Main Street, where people with simpler lives walked by, oblivious to the earthquake happening in her small world. "Why now?" she whispered to no one. "After all this time." Another cough from behind the curtain made her straighten her spine. She glanced down at her worn uniform, the faded blue smock with Sunshine Laundry embroidered across the pocket, from waitress to laundry attendant. Not exactly the American dream she'd imagined when she'd left San Francisco for love. With quiet determination, Grace walked to the break room and knelt beside the sofa. She reached underneath, her fingers finding the cardboard edge of the box that contained her secrets. For years, she had kept silent. For years, she had shouldered the burden alone. "Ma?" a small voice called from behind the curtain that separated the laundromat from their makeshift living space. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, Sam," she replied, quickly sliding the box back under the couch. "Just finishing up some work." But everything wasn't fine. Troy Henderson, The man who had abandoned her, who had called her a liar and a cheat, was getting married, and he had invited her to witness it, to stand in the shadows while he stepped into the light with another woman. Grace looked down at her hands, rough from work and motherhood. Then she looked at the invitation again, at the elegant names engraved on expensive paper. "No," she said quietly, a new fire lighting in her eyes. "No, this isn't how our story ends." She walked back to the counter and placed the invitation under the register. There was a decision to be made, a choice that could change everything. For her children, for Troy. The broken clock on the wall remained stuck, but Grace Chen's life had just lurched forward. Outside, a late model car backfired, making her jump. Through the window, she watched a couple walk by, young, in love, untested. Once that had been her and Troy, before life and lies had torn them apart. Grace touched her throat, feeling the phantom weight of the jade pendant Troy had given her when he proposed, sold long ago to pay for diapers and formula. She looked toward the curtain, behind which her three greatest treasures slept, unaware of the storm brewing. "This time," she whispered to herself, "you'll see what you left behind." With trembling fingers, Grace slid the shoebox from beneath the worn sofa. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light as she lifted the lid, revealing her most closely guarded treasures. She hadn't opened this box in months, afraid that touching the memories would make the pain fresh again. The laundromat's hum faded into background noise as she lifted out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. These were the letters she had written to Troy after he'd thrown her out. Letters returned unopened, her pleas unread, and her truths untold. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, time slowly claiming them just as it had claimed her youth. "Ma?" Sam's small voice startled her. The oldest of the triplets by 7 minutes stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. At 5 years old, he had Troy's chin, strong and slightly cleft. "Hey, baby," Grace whispered, quickly tucking the letters back into the box. "Did you have a good nap?" Sam nodded, his gaze drifting to the box. "What's that?" "Just some old things." Grace patted the space beside her. "Come sit with me for a minute." As Sam nestled against her side, Grace reached into the box and pulled out a stack of photographs. The top one showed her and Troy on their first date, at the county fair, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something now forgotten. She had been 22 then, fresh out of culinary school and working at the Blue Magnolia, the upscale restaurant where Troy had first noticed her. "Who's that man?" Sam asked, pointing to Troy's face in the photograph. Grace swallowed hard. "That's just someone I used to know." Sam's small finger traced Troy's smile. "He looks like Ethan when he laughs." The observation sent a pang through Grace's heart. Ethan, the middle triplet, did indeed have Troy's smile, the same dimple appearing in his right cheek. All three boys carried pieces of their father in their features. Sam had his chin, Ethan his smile, and little Michael had his eyes. Those piercing blue eyes that Grace sometimes found hard to look into. Carefully returning the photos to the box, Grace pulled out 3 small toothbrushes. Each was a different color, red, blue, and green, with names carefully written in permanent marker. Sam, Ethan, Michael. She ran her thumb over the lettering, remembering the night she'd written them. Sitting on the floor of a homeless shelter, determined that her children would have at least one thing that was truly theirs. "Why do you keep our old toothbrushes, Ma?" Sam asked, his innocent question loaded with a history he couldn't possibly understand. Grace kissed the top of his head. "Because they remind me of how far we've come." And they had come far. From the shelter to a friend's couch, to a motel room, to this small apartment attached to the laundromat where she worked 16-hour days. Not exactly the American dream, but a far cry from where they'd started. The sound of shuffling feet drew their attention to the doorway again. Ethan and Michael stood hand in hand, their hair mussed from sleep, wearing matching hand-me-down pajamas Grace had found at the church donation bin. "I'm hungry," Ethan announced, rubbing his stomach. "Me too," echoed Michael, the smallest of the three, his voice still thick with sleep. Grace carefully placed the toothbrushes back in the box and closed the lid. "Let's get you boys something to eat." As she rose to prepare a simple dinner of peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices, a far cry from the gourmet meals she once created, her mind wandered back to the invitation. Why had Troy invited her to his wedding? Was it simple cruelty? A way to show her what she had lost or what he thought she had thrown away? The boys chattered around the small kitchen table, their innocent voices a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Grace's heart. She watched them eat, these three miracles who had saved her even as they complicated her life beyond measure. She had never told Troy about the pregnancy. By the time she realized she was carrying triplets, he had already branded her unfaithful and thrown her out of their apartment, believing his mother's lies about Grace's supposed infidelity. Pride and pain had kept her silent in those early days, and then survival had taken precedence over everything else. Now watching her sons, their sons, Grace felt a resolve hardening within her. Troy Henderson deserved to know what he had walked away from, not for her sake, but for theirs. After tucking the boys into the makeshift beds, 3 narrow cots squeezed into what had once been a storage room, Grace returned to the shoebox. This time, she removed a hospital bracelet and a folded document, the results of a paternity test she'd paid for with money she couldn't spare, insurance against a day she had never planned to face, until now. "I'm not going to that wedding to watch," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to be seen." The next morning, after getting the boys dressed and settled with coloring books in the break room, Grace made a call to the one person in town who might help her. Hector Ramirez, a mechanic who had immigrated from Mexico 15 years earlier and had always shown her kindness when her ancient Honda needed repairs she couldn't afford. "I need to borrow something special," she told him, her voice steady with newfound determination. "Just for one day." As she spoke, her eyes fell on the invitation still sitting on the counter. The gold lettering seemed to mock her, but Grace Chen was done being mocked, done being invisible, done being the secret best forgotten. For 5 years, she had protected Troy from the consequences of his choices. Now it was time for truth to have its day. Hector's auto shop sat on the outskirts of Greenwood, a weathered building with peeling paint and a sign that had seen better days. The yard around it was littered with car parts and salvaged vehicles in various states of repair. To most of the town's affluent residents, it was an eyesore. To Grace, it was a sanctuary of honest work and genuine kindness. As she guided the triplets through the gravel lot, the Mississippi sun beat down mercilessly. July in the Delta was unforgiving, the humidity wrapping around them like a damp blanket. Sweat beaded on Grace's forehead, but she straightened her posture as Hector emerged from the garage bay, wiping greasy hands on a rag. "Grace," he greeted her warmly, his accent still thick despite his years in America. "And the 3 amigos. Look how big you are getting." The boys giggled as Hector pretended to test their muscles, flexing his own tattooed arms in response to their childish displays of strength. Grace watched with a small smile, grateful for this man who had never once looked at her with pity, only respect. "Did you think about what I asked?" she said, when the children were distracted by a stray cat weaving between junked cars. Hector's expression grew serious. "I made some calls. It wasn't easy, but—" He gestured for her to follow him to a small office at the back of the garage. The room was cramped and smelled of motor oil and the strong coffee Hector brewed throughout the day. He shuffled through a stack of papers on his cluttered desk and pulled out a photograph. "My cousin in New Orleans has connections with a specialty car service. They cater to weddings, graduations, quinceañeras, special occasions." He handed her the picture. "This is what they can provide." Grace's breath caught as she stared at the image of a vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, its gleaming silver body and polished chrome, a stark contrast to the junked cars outside. It was elegant, classic, a symbol of wealth and prestige that would turn heads in a town where such luxuries were reserved for the elite few. "Hector, I can't possibly afford—" He held up a hand to stop her. "My cousin owes me a favor. Big favor. He can get it here the day before the wedding and take it back the day after, no charge." Grace's eyes widened. "No charge? But this must cost thousands." "Consider it my gift to you and the boys," Hector said firmly. "Everyone deserves to feel like royalty once in their life, no?" Tears threatened, but Grace blinked them away. She had shed enough tears over the past 5 years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Just promise me something," Hector said, lowering his voice. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. People like the Hendersons and the Carters, they don't like surprises. They don't like things they can't control." Grace's jaw tightened. That's exactly the problem. With the car arranged, Grace faced her next challenge: clothes. The invitation's snide remark about being properly dressed burned in her memory as she led the triplets toward Greenwood's small downtown area. The thrift store on Main Street was her destination, It was all she could afford. "Ma, why do we need fancy clothes?" Ethan asked, skipping alongside her, his hand firmly in hers. "Are we going somewhere special?" Grace hesitated. How much should she tell them? They were only 5, too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, too innocent to grasp the cruelty of what had happened to their family. "Yes, baby," she finally answered. "We're going to a party." The Salvation Army store was nearly empty when they entered, the air conditioning a welcome relief from the southern heat. Mrs. Key. Patterson, the elderly volunteer who had often set aside children's clothes in good condition for Grace, smiled at them from behind the counter. "My goodness, look at these handsome young men," she cooed. "Growing like weeds, aren't they?" While Mrs. Patterson entertained the boys with stickers, Grace combed through the racks with a practiced eye. For the boys, she found 3 small suits, not matching but similar enough in navy blue. They would need alterations, but Grace's sewing skills had improved out of necessity over the years. For herself, the options were more limited. She was about to settle for a simple navy dress that would complement the boys' suits when her eye caught a flash of black on the end of the rack. Pushing aside a floral sundress, she pulled out a sleeveless black sheath dress. The label, partially obscured but still visible, read Chanel. Grace nearly gasped. How had such a piece ended up here? The dress was at least a decade old, but the quality was unmistakable. She checked the price tag. $15.99. A fortune for her, but a fraction of the dress's true worth. "Someone's loss is your gain," Mrs. Patterson said, noticing Grace's interest. "Donation from an estate sale up on Magnolia Avenue last month. Rich folks throw away better things than most of us will ever own." Magnolia Avenue, where the Hendersons lived. The coincidence wasn't lost on Grace. With trembling hands, she checked the size. It would be slightly large, but nothing she couldn't alter. That night, after the triplets were asleep, Grace sat cross-legged on her small bed, carefully taking in the sides of the black dress by hand. Each stitch was precise, each tuck deliberate. As she worked, she imagined the faces of the wedding guests when she arrived. The whispers, the stares, the shock. But most of all, she imagined Troy's face when he saw who he had discarded so callously. The next day, after closing the laundromat early, Grace drove her battered Honda to Hector's shop for final arrangements. The Rolls-Royce had arrived, its silver body gleaming in the late afternoon sun like a mirage. "It's even more beautiful than the picture," Grace murmured, running a hesitant hand along its smooth surface. "Wait until you see inside." Hector grinned, opening the door to reveal sumptuous leather seats and polished wood trim. As Grace leaned in to inspect the interior, something caught her eye. An envelope, slightly yellowed with age, tucked halfway under the passenger seat. She reached for it and froze when she saw the name written in elegant script across the front. "Troy." "What's this?" she asked, holding up the envelope. Hector frowned. "I don't know. This car has been in storage for years. Perhaps something left behind by a previous client." Grace turned the envelope over in her hands. The handwriting was hauntingly familiar, but she couldn't place it. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately to see if it contained something that might help her cause. But another part, the part that still believed in basic decency despite everything, held back. "I'll keep it safe," she said, tucking the envelope into her purse, maybe after the wedding. As she drove home, the mysterious envelope weighed heavy in her bag, like a ticking clock counting down to a moment of truth not yet defined. First Baptist Church of Greenwood stood majestically against the cloudless July sky, its white steeple gleaming in the afternoon sun. Built in the 1890s, it had witnessed generations of Mississippi's elite exchange their vows beneath its vaulted ceiling and stained glass windows. Today was no exception. Black luxury sedans and SUVs lined the oak-shaded street, disgorging passengers in designer suits and pastel summer dresses. Inside, the sanctuary hummed with the low murmur of Greenwood's upper crust. Floral arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas adorned every pew end, their sweet fragrance mixing with expensive perfumes. A string quartet played Pachelbel's Canon in D, the elegant notes floating through the air like the champagne bubbles that would flow later at the Carter estate. In the front pew, Eleanor Henderson sat rigid in pale blue silk, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her spine straight as a ramrod despite her 70 years. She surveyed the guests with practiced detachment, acknowledging acquaintances with the barest nod. This was her triumph, her son finally making the match she had orchestrated for years, erasing the embarrassment of his youthful indiscretion with that foreign waitress. Near the altar, Troy Henderson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. At 32, he cut a striking figure in his tailored tuxedo, his dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples. To casual observers, he appeared the picture of a contented groom. Only his best man noticed the tight set of his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands when he checked his watch. "Relax, man," whispered James Whitfield, clapping a hand on Troy's shoulder. "Cold feet are normal." Troy forced a smile. "Just ready to get this over with." "Romantic," James snorted. "Don't let Abigail hear you talking like that." Troy's response was cut short by a signal from the wedding planner. The quartet transitioned to Mendelssohn's Wedding March, and the massive oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open. The guests rose as one, turning to catch their first glimpse of the bride. Abigail Carter appeared in a cloud of white tulle and lace. Her father, Robert Carter, bank president and third-generation Greenwood royalty, beaming proudly at her side. She was beautiful in the way that wealth and privilege often ensured. Perfect teeth, perfect skin, perfect poise cultivated through years of cotillion lessons and finishing school. As the bride glided down the aisle, Troy found his gaze drifting toward the back of the church, scanning the unfamiliar faces. He'd invited Grace on a vindictive impulse, never actually expecting her to show. Yet a part of him, a part he refused to acknowledge, had been looking for her since the guests began arriving. The ceremony was about to begin when the first unusual sound intruded on the perfect tableau, the distinctive purr of a powerful engine, growing louder as it approached the church. The string quartet faltered as heads began to turn toward the windows. Outside, bathed in golden afternoon light, a vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow eased to a stop directly in front of the church steps. A collective gasp rippled through the sanctuary as the chauffeur, Hector, though none recognized him in his borrowed uniform, opened the passenger door with a flourish. A slender leg emerged first, then another, sheathed in sheer black stockings that disappeared beneath the hem of an elegant black dress. Grace Chen stepped out into the sunlight, her glossy black hair swept up in a simple chignon, her makeup understated but flawless. The Chanel dress, altered to fit her petite frame perfectly, skimmed her curves in a way that made several women in the congregation narrow their eyes in envy. But it was what happened next that caused Robert Carter to choke on his own breath and Eleanor Henderson to clutch her pearl necklace in horror. One by one, 3 small boys in navy blue suits emerged from the Rolls-Royce. Each was the spitting image of Troy Henderson at age 5. The same strong jawline, the same straight nose, the same piercing blue eyes. Only their slightly darker skin and the subtle almond shape of their eyes hinted at their mixed heritage. The church fell silent as Grace took the hands of the 2 younger boys, while the oldest, Sam, walked slightly ahead, his chin raised with the same determination that now hardened his mother's delicate features. "Who invited them?" someone whispered, the words carrying in the shocked silence. "Is that the waitress? The one he was with before? My God, look at those children." Troy stood frozen at the altar, the blood draining from his face as recognition dawned. Beside him, Abigail's triumphant smile faltered, her knuckles whitening around her bouquet of white roses. Grace walked slowly up the center aisle, her head held high despite the weight of 100 stairs. She moved with quiet dignity, her eyes fixed on Troy's increasingly ashen face. The triplets stayed close, wide-eyed but solemn, as if they sensed the gravity of the moment. They stopped halfway up the aisle, close enough to be seen clearly by everyone, but far enough to maintain a respectful distance from the ceremony they had come to disrupt. For one eternal moment, Grace simply looked at Troy, allowing him to take in the sight of his sons, the children he never knew existed. Then, in a voice that was soft, yet carried to every corner of the hushed sanctuary, she spoke the words that would shatter the perfect facade of the Henderson-Carter wedding. "Congratulations, Troy. Your sons wanted to see their father get married." A collective gasp swept through the church, followed by a rising tide of whispers. Eleanor Henderson swayed in her seat, a hand pressed to her chest. Robert Carter's face turned an alarming shade of purple, and Abigail, beautiful, perfect Abigail, let her bouquet slip from her fingers, white rose petals scattering across the polished floor like snow. Troy took a halting step forward, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The boys stared up at him with innocent curiosity, seeing in the flesh the man whose features they carried. "Ma, is that him?" little Michael stage whispered, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is that our daddy?" Time seemed to stand still in the church as Michael's innocent question hung in the air. Grace gently squeezed her youngest son's hand, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The past and present collided violently in her mind, memories flashing before her eyes like scenes from a movie she'd watched 1,000 times. 5 years earlier, Greenwood Regional Hospital. Grace sat alone in a plastic chair, still in her waitress uniform, staring in disbelief at the ultrasound printout in her trembling hands. "Triplets," the technician had said, pointing to 3 distinct shapes on the grainy black and white image. "Congratulations. Congratulations," as if carrying 3 babies while barely making ends meet was cause for celebration, as if she hadn't been thrown out of her apartment just 2 days before, her belongings stuffed into garbage bags, Troy's accusations still ringing in her ears. "Who is he?" Troy had demanded, waving a lipstick-stained napkin in her face. "Don't lie to me, Grace. My mother saw you with him." The memory of that night sliced through her like a freshly sharpened knife. She'd been working a double shift at the Blue Magnolia, covering for a sick colleague. The him was Mario, the 60-year-old Italian chef who had smudged his wife's lipstick on a napkin while demonstrating a new cooking technique to Grace. "Troy, please," she had begged. "Let me explain. There's nobody else. I love you." But he wouldn't listen. Eleanor Henderson had been planting seeds of doubt for months, and they had finally taken root. Troy, the man who had once promised to love her forever, had chosen to believe the worst about her without a second thought. "Get out," he had said, his voice cold and final. "I want you gone by morning." She had left a letter, pages long, explaining everything, begging him to call her, telling him she thought she might be pregnant. She'd slipped it under the door of the apartment they'd shared, hoping against hope that he would read it, that he would come to his senses. He never called. A week later, she'd seen him at the grocery store with Abigail Carter, laughing as if his world hadn't just imploded, as if Grace had never existed at all. The memory dissolved, replaced by another. Grace in a cramped examination room, 5 months pregnant, her belly already enormous with the triplets. "Ms. Chen, you need bed rest," the doctor had insisted. "These babies are coming early, triplets always do, and you're showing signs of preeclampsia." "I can't afford bed rest," she had replied, fighting back tears. "I need to work." She had lost the waitressing job. Eleanor Henderson was friends with the restaurant owner. The only work she could find was cleaning houses, on her feet all day, swollen ankles and aching back protesting with every step. Then came the day her water broke, 2 months early, the frantic rush to the hospital. The terror of emergency surgery, the antiseptic smell of the NICU where her tiny sons spent their first month of life, hooked to machines that kept them alive while Grace shuttled between her new job at the laundromat and the hospital, sleeping in chairs, surviving on vending machine snacks. No one had been there to hold her hand. No one had paced the waiting room during her C-section. No one had brought flowers or balloons or tiny baby clothes. And now standing in this church with its flowery opulence and stained glass casting colored shadows across her sons' faces, the injustice of it all threatened to choke her. The flashbacks ended as abruptly as they had begun. Grace blinked, returning to the present moment where chaos had erupted in the once orderly sanctuary. Abigail had recovered her voice and was now shouting at Troy, her perfectly made-up face contorted with fury. "You told me there were no children. You swore to me." Troy stood paralyzed, his gaze locked on the 3 small boys who shared his features. His best man, James, whispered urgently in his ear, but Troy seemed beyond hearing. Eleanor Henderson had risen from her seat and was pushing her way toward Grace, her face a mask of cold fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but venomous. "How dare you bring these children here, today of all days?" Grace met her former mother-in-law's gaze steadily. "They have a right to know their father, and he has a right to know them." "Troy," Abigail's voice cut through the murmurs like a whip crack, "tell everyone right now that these are not your children." All eyes turned to Troy, who seemed to finally shake himself from his trance. He took a step toward Grace and the boys, uncertainty written across his features. "Grace," he began, his voice hoarse, "I don't understand. When did you... How could you... 9 months after you threw me out," Grace replied quietly. "They were born premature. They spent a month in the NICU. I wrote to you. I called. Your mother said you wanted nothing to do with me." Troy's eyes darted to Eleanor, who straightened her shoulders defensively. "Troy!" Abigail demanded, her voice rising with hysteria. Tell them these are not your children." Troy swallowed hard, looked at the boys once more, then back at his bride. His voice, when it finally came, was hollow. "These children are not mine." The words struck Grace like a physical blow. She had prepared herself for many reactions, but not this, not outright denial in the face of such obvious evidence. "You're lying," she whispered. It was Sam who moved first, breaking away from his mother's side. From his small suit pocket, he withdrew a folded piece of paper that Grace instantly recognized, the ultrasound image she had kept all these years. He marched directly to Troy and held it out with a solemn expression that seemed too old for his 5-year-old face. "My mom says this is us before we were born," Sam said, his clear voice carrying in the hushed church. "See? It has your name on it." Troy took the paper with unsteady hands. There at the top was printed, "Patient Chen Grace," and below it, "Contact Emergency, Henderson, Troy." He stared at it for a long moment, then raised his eyes to Grace's, confusion and the first flicker of doubt evident in their blue depths. "You need to leave," Robert Carter announced, his authoritative voice brooking no argument as he stepped into the center aisle. "This wedding will proceed without further interruption." Grace knew it was time to go. She had accomplished what she came for, planted the seed of truth that would grow whether Troy wanted it to or not. She reached for Sam's hand, gently pulling him back to her side. "We're leaving," she said quietly, dignity intact despite the hurricane of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I just wanted you to see them, Troy. Once." She turned to guide the triplets back down the aisle, feeling the weight of 100 judgmental stares on her back, when Troy's voice stopped her. "Wait." Grace paused at Troy's voice, but didn't turn around. Her hands trembled as they held onto the boys, who looked up at her with confusion in their innocent eyes. The church remained eerily silent, hundreds of breath held in anticipation. "I need," Troy's voice cracked, "I need a minute. Please, everyone." Abigail's face contorted with fury. "A minute? A minute? You don't need a minute, Troy. You need to tell this woman and these children to leave so we can get married." Robert Carter placed a restraining hand on his daughter's arm, his expression grim but calculating. "Perhaps we should step into the vestry and discuss this privately," he suggested, his tone leaving no room for argument. The wedding party moved toward the side door, Abigail practically dragged by her father, Eleanor Henderson, following with rigid posture that betrayed nothing of her inner turmoil. Troy hesitated, glancing back at Grace and the boys before disappearing through the door. The guests erupted into furious whispers the moment the door closed. Grace felt exposed under their scrutiny, a specimen under glass. She guided the triplets back down the aisle with as much dignity as she could muster, their small dress shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. Outside, the summer heat enveloped them like a suffocating blanket. Grace helped the boys into the Rolls-Royce, her movements mechanical, her mind still processing what had just happened. Troy's denial had cut deeper than she'd expected. Even with the evidence literally staring him in the face, he had chosen the lie. "Are we going home now, Ma?" Ethan asked, his lower lip trembling slightly. Grace managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, baby. We're going home." Hector started the engine, the luxurious car purring to life. As they pulled away from the church, Grace finally allowed the tears she'd been holding back to fall, turning her face toward the window so the boys wouldn't see. The drive back to their apartment above the laundromat passed in a blur. Grace's thoughts churned like the washing machines downstairs, cycles of anger, grief, and vindication spinning endlessly. By the time they arrived, her emotional exhaustion was complete. "Why don't you boys change into your play clothes?" she suggested, helping them out of their tiny suits. "You can watch cartoons for a little while." Once the triplets were settled in front of their small television, a second-hand set with temperamental reception, Grace retreated to the bathroom, the only private space in their cramped living quarters. She sat on the edge of the tub, still wearing the elegant black dress, and finally allowed herself to break down completely. Silent sobs racked her body as she replayed the scene in the church, the shocked faces, the whispers, Troy's denial. She had prepared herself for many outcomes, but the raw pain of his rejection still took her breath away. When she had cried herself empty, Grace splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her, eyes red-rimmed but determined, jaw set in a line of resolve. "It's done," she whispered to herself. "You did what you came to do." Changing into a worn t-shirt and jeans, Grace remembered the mysterious envelope from the Rolls-Royce. She retrieved it from her purse, turning it over in her hands once more. The name Troy, written in elegant script, seemed to taunt her now. After a moment's hesitation, she carefully opened it, half expecting to find blank paper inside, another disappointment in a day full of them. Instead, she pulled out a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery, the ink slightly faded with age. The date at the top caught her attention immediately. 5 years ago, just weeks after Troy had thrown her out. The signature at the bottom made her blood run cold. Eleanor Henderson. Grace's hands shook as she began to read. "My dearest Troy, by the time you read this, I hope you will have come to your senses regarding that waitress. I know you believe yourself to be in love with her, but you must understand that she is not one of us. She could never fit into our world, our society. Your father would be turning in his grave if he knew you were considering making her a permanent part of our family. I must confess something to you now, something I've done for your own good. I found a letter she left for you the day after you asked her to leave. I read it and burned it immediately. She claimed to be pregnant, Troy. Can you imagine? An obvious ploy to trap you. I also destroyed the medical records she included, some kind of prenatal appointment, another desperate attempt to maintain her hold on you and your inheritance. I told her when she called that you wanted nothing more to do with her, that you had moved on with Abigail Carter, as you should have done from the beginning. I know one day you'll thank me for this intervention. The Hendersons and Carters have been connected for generations. This marriage has been anticipated since you and Abigail were children. It's the right choice for your future, for the family name. In time, you'll see I was right. All my love, Mother." Grace read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing fresh waves of shock and rage. The letter she'd written, explaining everything, begging Troy to call her, telling him about the pregnancy. He had never seen it. The ultrasound image from her first prenatal appointment, destroyed by Eleanor's hands. "She lied," Grace whispered, her voice strangled. "She lied to both of us." The magnitude of Eleanor Henderson's betrayal was staggering. She had deliberately destroyed evidence, intercepted communication, and manipulated her own son to ensure Grace disappeared from their lives. And in the process, she had robbed Troy of knowing his sons and the boys of knowing their father. Grace's hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely fold the letter. Her mind raced with implications, with possibilities. Troy hadn't known. He hadn't rejected his children. He hadn't even known they existed. A knock at the apartment door startled her from her thoughts. Grace quickly tucked the letter into her pocket and went to answer it, expecting perhaps Mrs. Wilson from downstairs complaining about the noise again. Instead, she found Troy Henderson standing in her doorway, still in his wedding tuxedo, his bow tie undone and hanging loose around his neck. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. "Grace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to know the truth." Behind her, she heard one of the boys call out, "Ma, who's at the door?" Troy's gaze shifted over her shoulder, his expression a complex mixture of fear, curiosity, and something else, something that might have been hope. "Please," he said, meeting her eyes again. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking for." Grace's hand went to the letter in her pocket, feeling its weight, the physical evidence of a betrayal that had shaped the last 5 years of all their lives. "The truth," she said softly. "Yes, I think it's time for that." Grace's tiny apartment suddenly felt even smaller with Troy standing in it. He seemed out of place among the second-hand furniture and faded curtains, like an exotic bird that had accidentally flown into a sparrow's nest. His eyes darted around, taking in the cramped living conditions, the fold-out couch where Grace slept, the 3 small cots squeezed into what had once been a storage closet, the water stains on the ceiling. "Boys," Grace called, her voice steadier than she felt, "go play in your room for a little while. Mama needs to talk to someone." The triplets peered curiously at Troy from behind the worn sofa. Sam, always the boldest, stepped forward first. "You're the man from the church," he said, studying Troy with an intensity that made the grown man shift uncomfortably. "The one in the picture." Troy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Are you really our daddy?" Ethan asked, emerging from his hiding place. Grace intervened before Troy could respond. Boys, please, go to your room now. We'll talk later. Reluctantly, the triplets retreated, but not before Michael, the smallest and most sensitive of the three, gave Troy a long, searching look that seemed to pierce right through him. When they were alone, Grace gestured to the kitchen table, a battered yard sale find with mismatched chairs. "Sit," she said simply. Troy sat, looking awkward and oversized in the small chair. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the humming of the ancient refrigerator and the muffled giggles of the boys from the next room. "You left the wedding," Grace finally said, breaking the silence. Troy ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it further. I couldn't." He struggled to find words. "Everything fell apart after you left. Abigail was screaming, her father was threatening lawsuits, my mother was—" He stopped abruptly, as if just remembering something. My mother. She knew, didn't she? Grace reached into her pocket and withdrew Eleanor's letter. Without a word, she placed it on the table between them. "What's this?" Troy asked, not reaching for it. "The truth," Grace replied. "Read it." As Troy read the letter, Grace watched his face transform, shock giving way to disbelief, then to anger, and finally to a devastation so profound it was painful to witness. When he finished, he set the letter down with trembling hands. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "It was in the Rolls-Royce I borrowed for today, hidden under the seat. I don't know how it got there or why your mother never sent it." Grace paused. Maybe she wrote it to ease her conscience, but couldn't bring herself to tell you what she'd done. Troy's eyes closed briefly, his face a mask of pain. "All this time, she told me you refused to speak to me, that you'd moved away to start fresh, that you—" His voice broke. "That you'd had an abortion." Grace gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. The cruelty of the lie struck her anew. "No," she whispered. "No, I would never have—" "I know that now." Troy's eyes opened, fixing on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think I always knew she was lying, but it was easier to believe her than to face what I'd done to you." A wave of dizziness suddenly swept over Grace. The room tilted alarmingly, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. "Grace?" Troy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" She tried to nod, but the movement sent a sharp pain lancing through her head. "I'm fine," she managed, but even to her own ears, the words sounded faint and unconvincing. The truth was she wasn't fine. Hadn't been for weeks now. The headaches had started in early June, just dull throbs at first, easy to ignore when there were mouths to feed and bills to pay. But they had grown steadily worse, more frequent, more debilitating. There had been other symptoms too. The numbness in her left hand, the occasional blurring of vision, the lapses in memory. She'd attributed them to stress, exhaustion, the cumulative toll of 5 years of struggling to survive. "You're not fine," Troy insisted, rising from his chair as Grace swayed dangerously. "You're white as a sheet." Before she could protest, another wave of pain crashed through her skull, and this time darkness followed. She was dimly aware of strong arms catching her before she hit the floor, of a voice calling her name with increasing urgency. Then nothing. She awoke to the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. For a disoriented moment, Grace thought she was back in the maternity ward, had just given birth to the triplets. But the absence of the post-surgical pain and the sight of an IV in her arm quickly dispelled that notion. "You're awake." Grace turned her head, slowly, cautiously, to find Troy sitting in a chair beside her bed, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his shirt wrinkled and untucked. He looked as if he'd aged years in a matter of hours. "The boys," Grace began, trying to sit up, "are with Mrs. Patterson from the thrift store," Troy assured her, gently pressing her back against the pillows. "She came over when she heard the ambulance, said to tell you not to worry, that she'd stay with them as long as needed." Grace relaxed slightly. Mrs. Patterson was kind, and the boys knew her well. They would be safe. "What happened?" she asked. Though part of her already knew the answer, Troy's expression was grim. "You collapsed. The doctors ran some tests, a CT scan and then an MRI. Grace closed her eyes. "Tell me." There was a long pause, filled only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. When Troy finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "It's a tumor," he said quietly, "in your brain. They're not sure yet how advanced it is, but it's not good," Grace finished for him, opening her eyes to meet his gaze directly. A single tear tracked down Troy's cheek as he shook his head. "No, it's not good." Grace absorbed this information with a strange sense of detachment. Somehow it didn't feel like a surprise. Perhaps some part of her had known all along that the headaches were more than stress, that her body was betraying her in the most fundamental way. "The boys," she said again, this time with more urgency. "Troy, if something happens to me—" "Don't," he interrupted, reaching for her hand. "Don't talk like that. There are treatments, specialists. I'll make sure you get the best care possible." Grace gave him a sad smile. "You're still getting married. To Abigail, that's your life now." Troy's grip on her hand tightened. "The wedding's off," he said firmly. "After what I learned today, after what my mother did," he shook his head. "None of that matters now. What matters is getting you well. And the boys. Getting to know my sons." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Grace's eyes. After all the years of struggle, of loneliness, of wondering if she'd made the right choice in keeping silent, to hear him claim the triplets so unhesitatingly was a balm to her wounded soul. But it was too late. She could feel it in the heaviness of her limbs, in the persistent fog that seemed to cloud her thoughts, in the way the pain in her head never fully receded, even with the medication flowing through her IV. "I need to record something," she said suddenly. "For the boys. In case—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Troy nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll get my phone. We can make a video." As he stepped out of the room to retrieve his phone from the nurse's station where it was charging, Grace stared at the ceiling, mentally composing what might be her final message to her sons. There was so much to say, so many lessons still untaught, so much love still unexpressed, and there was one more truth that needed to be told, to Troy, to the boys, to herself. A truth about forgiveness, about letting go, about the hope that somehow from all this pain, something good might yet emerge. Autumn came to Greenwood with a gentle touch, painting the oak trees in shades of amber and gold. The cemetery on Cherry Hill stood quiet under the morning sun, dew still glistening on the freshly cut grass. A small gathering had assembled around a simple cherry wood casket, adorned with white lilies, and a single framed photograph of Grace Chen, her smile radiant and timeless. The triplets stood at the front of the mourners, each wearing the navy blue suits Grace had altered for them with such care. Sam, ever the protector, stood slightly ahead of his brothers, his small shoulders squared against the weight of their loss. Ethan clutched a well-worn teddy bear that still carried the faint scent of their mother's perfume. Michael, the youngest by minutes, held tight to Mrs. Patterson's hand, his eyes wide and solemn in his tear-streaked face. Spread across their laps was the quilt Grace had finished in her final weeks, a labor of love sewn in the hospital bed where she'd spent her last days. Each panel featured a memory: the boys' first day of preschool, a rare trip to the county fair, quiet evenings reading stories in their tiny apartment. In the center, she had painstakingly embroidered the word "Mother," surrounded by 3 small handprints. The minister's words floated over the gathering, platitudes about God's plan and heavenly reunions that did little to comfort those left behind. What mattered were the memories, the love that Grace had poured into her all-too-brief life, the legacy she left in 3 small boys with their father's eyes and their mother's indomitable spirit. Troy Henderson stood apart from the main group, as if unsure of his place in this gathering of people who had known and loved Grace when he had not. The past 2 months had transformed him. Gone was the polished facade of the wealthy businessman, replaced by a man hollowed out by regret and newfound responsibility. His suit, expensive but rumpled from nights spent in hospital chairs, hung loosely on his frame, evidence of meals skipped and sleep forsaken, as he'd tried to make up for 5 lost years in Grace's final weeks. Eleanor Henderson was conspicuously absent. The revelation of her deception had created a rift between mother and son that might never be bridged. Troy had moved out of the family estate the day after Grace collapsed, taking a small apartment near the hospital, where he could be close to her and begin the tentative process of knowing his sons. As the minister concluded the service, Hector Ramirez stepped forward. The mechanic who had helped Grace in her moment of need now served as pallbearer, his weathered hands gentle on the casket that held his friend. "Grace Chen was the strongest person I ever knew," Hector said, his accent thickening with emotion. "She faced every day with courage and dignity, even when life was unfair. She never complained, never asked why me. She just loved her boys and did whatever it took to give them a good life." Mrs. Patterson spoke next, describing Grace's determination to provide for her children despite overwhelming odds. The laundromat owner recalled her work ethic and quiet grace. A teacher from the triplets preschool shared stories of Grace's involvement despite her exhausting work schedule, how she had sewn costumes for the school play, baked cookies for birthdays, never missing a parent-teacher conference no matter how tired she might be. These were the people who had become Grace's family, when her own family had rejected her for marrying outside her culture, when Troy's family had deemed her unworthy of their name. These were the people who had witnessed her struggle and her triumph, who had seen her not as Troy Henderson's mistake, but as a woman of extraordinary courage. When the formal service ended and the small crowd began to disperse, Troy finally approached the triplets. He knelt before them, his eyes level with theirs, unsure of what to say. Though they had spent time together in the hospital during Grace's final weeks, their relationship remained tentative, fragile. "Your mom was the bravest person I've ever known," he said finally, his voice rough with unshed tears, "and she loved you more than anything in this world." Sam regarded him with a gaze too old for his 5 years. "She said we should give you a chance," he replied solemnly. "She said you didn't know about us before." Troy swallowed hard, humbled by Grace's forgiveness, a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. "That's right," he acknowledged, "but I know now, and I want to be your dad. If you'll let me." Ethan studied him skeptically. "Do we have to call you Daddy?" "No," Troy assured him quickly. "You can call me whatever you feel comfortable with." Michael, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward and placed his small hand on Troy's cheek. "Mama said you have a big house. Do you have beds for us there?" The innocent question nearly broke Troy. In her final days, as the tumor claimed more of her strength and lucidity, Grace had made him promise to care for the boys, to give them the security and opportunities she never could. She had recorded videos for them, birthday messages for years to come, advice for their first dates, graduation, all the milestones she knew she would miss, and she had recorded one more message for Troy alone. The envelope containing the memory card sat in his pocket now, still unopened. "Watch it when you're ready," Grace had whispered, her once vibrant voice reduced to a thread. "When you need to remember why forgiveness matters." "Yes," Troy answered Michael, blinking back tears. "There are beds for each of you, and rooms of your own, and a backyard with swings." The boy nodded seriously as if this information confirmed something important. "Okay." Mrs. Patterson approached, holding a small backpack that contained the boys' few possessions. "Their things are all packed," she said quietly. "Grace arranged everything before—" She didn't finish the sentence. Troy nodded gratefully. In truth, he was terrified of fatherhood, of failure, of somehow dishonoring Grace's memory. But he was determined to try to become the man she had believed he could be. As the cemetery workers waited discreetly to complete their solemn task, Troy led the triplets toward the parking lot, where a familiar vehicle waited, the vintage Rolls-Royce that had caused such a sensation at his almost wedding. He had tracked down the owner and purchased it outright, a tangible link to the day that had changed all their lives. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a child's toothbrush, faded pink with the name Grace written in permanent marker, one final treasure from the shoebox of memories. The triplets climbed into the back seat, their small legs swinging above the floorboards, their faces solemn but curious as they embarked on this new chapter of their lives. Troy slipped behind the wheel, adjusting the mirror to keep the boys in view. The toothbrush swung gently, catching the autumn sunlight. It was then that he finally reached into his pocket and withdrew the envelope Grace had entrusted to him. Whatever message she had left, he was ready to hear it now. "Where are we going?" Sam asked as Troy started the engine. Troy met his son's gaze in the rearview mirror, those eyes so like his own, yet filled with Grace's wisdom and resilience. "Home," he answered simply. "We're going home." Sometimes life presents us with impossible choices, moments where pride battles with forgiveness and truth fights against comfort. Grace Chen faced these battles every day for 5 years, raising 3 boys alone while carrying the weight of unspoken truths. She could have remained invisible, could have protected herself from further rejection. Instead, she chose courage, not just for herself, but for her children who deserved to know their father, and for Troy who had been deceived by his own mother's lies. What would you have done in Grace's position? Would you have found the strength to walk into that church, head held high, knowing you might face humiliation? Would you have recorded messages of love and forgiveness rather than bitterness, even as your life was slipping away? Grace's final gift wasn't just to her sons, but to Troy, a chance at redemption, at becoming the father he never knew he was. Perhaps the greatest act of love is forgiveness, especially when it's undeserved. Perhaps true strength isn't about revenge, but about making peace with the past, so others can have a better future. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Like, share, and tell us in the comments, what moment from Grace's journey affected you the most? Your support helps us continue bringing these extraordinary stories of ordinary people to light.